May 14, 2026, 062 local time, northern entrance to the Strait of Hormuz, 2 missiles, 88 seconds apart. 4 American sailors who never came home. The USS Mason, a guided missile destroyer with one of the most advanced combat systems in the US fleet, was struck twice in under 2 minutes by Iranian Noor anti-ship missiles. It was the worst single engagement damage to a US destroyer since the USS Cole was nearly sunk in a Yemeni harbor in 2000. That's the part Iran wants the world to know about. What Tehran has not said publicly, what Iranian state media has carefully avoided, is what happened 2 hours and 11 minutes after those missiles hit. The missile crew that fired on the Mason did not know they had just activated a strike package pre-tasked weeks earlier. A strike package involving B-2 Spirit stealth bombers and 32 Tomahawk cruise missiles, already assigned, already flight planned, already waiting. They fired. And then the entire Fateh-110 production complex outside Semnan, the assembly halls, the underground component storage, the precision guidance integration facility, ceased to exist. The Fateh line has not produced a single missile since that morning. I'm your host at Defense Beacon, where we break down the military operations shaping global power. Today, we're reconstructing one of the most significant naval engagements of 2026, a strike and counterstrike sequence that has quietly rewritten the rules of Iranian deterrence in the Persian Gulf. This is not a story about American vulnerability. It is a story about how a carefully pre-positioned response was waiting for Iran to make exactly the mistake it made, and what that tells us about where the next confrontation is heading. To understand what happened on the morning of May 14th, you need to understand what was already in motion before that day arrived. Operation Project Freedom was not a reactive deployment. It was not assembled in response to the Mason strike. According to sources familiar with the operational planning cycle, Project Freedom was authorized in late April 2026, following a pattern of increasingly provocative Iranian activity in the northern Gulf that had been building for 6 weeks. Between late March and mid-April 2026, U.S. Fifth Fleet's surveillance assets recorded a series of anomalies along the Iranian coast near the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the Irgun, fast attack craft had been operating at unusual distances from their home ports, running what appeared to be coordinated patrol patterns rather than standard harassment maneuvers. Signals intelligence intercepted during this period suggested elevated communications traffic between Irgun coastal defense batteries and assets connected to the Fateh missile program. The assessment at Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain was cautious but clear. Iran was rehearsing something. What exactly, no one could say with confidence. The intelligence picture had gaps. 3 separate collection platforms had reported fragmentary data that, viewed individually, seemed inconclusive. Viewed together, they described an adversary preparing to escalate. The decision was made to pre-position assets and pre-task strike options before the trigger event arrived. Not to launch, not to preempt, but to be ready at a level that would compress the response window from hours to minutes. That decision, made in a conference room in Bahrain 6 weeks before the Mason was hit, is the reason the Fateh production line is gone. In the days following the Project Freedom authorization, the intelligence collection effort around the northern strait intensified. A P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft operating out of Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar flew a series of extended surveillance sorties along the Iranian coastline, its sensors mapping the electromagnetic signatures of coastal radar systems and cataloging the patrol rhythms of Irgun surface units. Overhead, a pair of RQ-4 Global Hawk high-altitude surveillance drones maintain near-continuous coverage of the approaches to the strait, their synthetic aperture radar capable of imaging through cloud cover and darkness. What the collection effort produced over 6 weeks was a detailed and troubling picture. The Irgun's Bandar Abbas base had been unusually active during the overnight hours, when American surveillance coverage was historically thinner. Vehicles had been observed transiting between the main base and a secondary site approximately 40 kilometers northeast along the coast, at times consistent with resupply or equipment movement. On 2 occasions, analysts noted the thermal signatures of what appeared to be missile transporter erector launcher vehicles, TELs positioned in overwatch locations with direct line-of-sight firing corridors into the primary shipping lanes. The Fateh-110 program had been a concern for Fifth Fleet intelligence analysts for over a year. The missile, a solid-fueled, road-mobile ballistic weapon in its land attack configuration, had been adapted into the Noor coastal defense variant, giving the Irgun a genuine anti-ship capability that could be repositioned rapidly and was difficult to track. The precision guidance integration facility outside Semnan was what made those missiles accurate. Without it, the Noor program could still produce airframes and warheads. It could not produce the guidance packages that made them dangerous at range. The analysts who built the Project Freedom target list understood this. They were not designing a punitive strike. They were designing a disabling blow aimed at the specific capability that made Iranian anti-ship operations worth fearing. The USS Mason DG-87, an Arleigh Burke-class flight IAA destroyer, arrived on station in the northern Strait of Hormuz on May 11, 3 days before the strike. She was operating as part of a surface action group under Operation Project Freedom, tasked with presence patrolling the transit corridor used by commercial shipping and U.S. naval vessels moving between the Gulf of Oman and the Persian Gulf. The Mason displaced approximately 9,200 tons fully loaded. Her combat systems included the AN-SPY-1DA, phased array radar driving the Aegis combat system, Mk-41 vertical launch system carrying a mix of SM-2 and MS-6 surface-to-air missiles, the Phalanx close-in weapon system, and the SLQ-32 electronic warfare suite. On paper, she was one of the best protected ships in the U.S. Navy's surface fleet. On paper, the Mason carried a crew of approximately 280 officers and enlisted personnel. Most were career sailors who understood in the abstract that a warship in a contested strait was a warship that might get shot at. Understanding that in the abstract and living it at 061 on a calm morning in the Strait of Hormuz are different things entirely. Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Del Rey, a damage controlman from Columbus, Ohio, had been assigned to a routine maintenance check in a compartment on the port side of the ship that morning. He had been in the Navy for 6 years, he had deployed twice before, he was 26 years old. He did not survive the impact of the second Noor missile. Engineman First Class Rosa Villanueva from San Antonio, Texas, had been awake since 0430, monitoring the ship's propulsion systems during a routine engineering watch. She was in her 9th year of service. She survived the strike, though a blast fragment from the hull breach would require surgeons in Bahrain to remove a 3-centimeter piece of steel from her left shoulder 2 days later. She described the moment of impact to the damage assessment team as a sound she could not compare to anything she had heard before. Not an explosion, she said, but a compression, as if the ship had been squeezed by something immense for a single instant. The morning of May 14th began without incident. The Mason was operating at patrol speed, approximately 12 knots, on a north-south transit lane roughly 14 nautical miles west of the Iranian coastline. Weather conditions were calm, visibility was good, sea state was light with swells under 1 meter. Nothing in the morning sensor picture suggested the threat already tracking toward her. The Noor anti-ship missile, Iran's domestically produced derivative of the Chinese C-802, is a subsonic sea-skimming weapon. It flies at approximately 20 meters above the water surface during its terminal approach, using an active radar seeker to lock onto its target. Its warhead is approximately 65 kilograms. Its range is listed at up to 170 kilometers, though operational employment typically occurs at shorter distances to maximize seeker effectiveness. The Noor is not a sophisticated modern anti-ship missile by great power standards. It doesn't fly at hypersonic speeds. It doesn't use complex maneuvering profiles. What it does is fly low, low enough that radar detection range is dramatically compressed by the curvature of the Earth. Against a surface ship, a sea-skimming missile at 20-meter altitude may not appear on radar until it is less than 20 nautical miles away. Against the Mason SPY-1D radar, operating in a cluttered coastal environment with multiple electronic signatures complicating the tracking picture, the detection window was narrower than doctrine anticipated. The launch site, subsequently identified through radar track reconstruction and post-strike satellite imagery, was a prepared coastal battery position approximately 22 kilometers northeast of the Mason's patrol position, tucked into a fold of rocky terrain that partially masked the launch signature from direct observation. The battery had been positioned there within the preceding 72 hours, a movement the surveillance architecture had detected but assessed as a routine rotation, rather than a forward deployment for imminent engagement. That assessment was wrong. At 0614 local time, the Mason's Combat Information Center received an automated threat warning. The SPY-1D had acquired a fast-moving low-altitude contact bearing northeast off the Iranian coast. Range 19.4 nautical miles, closing velocity, consistent with a subsonic anti-ship missile in terminal phase. The tactical action officer had less than 90 seconds to make a decision. Under standard Aegis engagement doctrine, the system can autonomously engage inbound threats if authorized by the commanding officer. The Mason's commanding officer, operating under the rules of engagement established for Project Freedom, had pre-authorized autonomous Aegis engagement for threats meeting specific criteria, including low-altitude, high-speed contacts originating from Iranian territorial waters on a direct intercept course. The system engaged. One SM-2 block-eye surface-to-air missile launched from the forward VLS cells at 06 17 seconds after initial acquisition. The SM-2 climbed, turned northeast, and intercepted the inbound Noor at a range of 11.3 nautical miles from the Mason. That intercept worked. What the Aegis system did not know, and what no one in the CIC fully processed in the seconds that followed, was that the first missile was not alone. The second Noor had been fired from a different launch position, offset by approximately 8 kilometers from the first battery, with a 41-second delay built into the firing sequence. Iranian doctrine for Noor employment against Aegis-equipped ships had evolved specifically to exploit the reload and re-engagement cycle of the SM-2 system. Fire first, draw the intercept, wait for the Aegis to cycle, fire second. The Mason's crew had been briefed that Iranian forces had been studying Aegis engagement timelines. That briefing had been delivered 11 days earlier, during the pre-deployment workup in Bahrain. The briefing officers, a lieutenant commander from the 5th Fleet Intelligence Staff, had walked through the 2-battery sequencing tactic in explicit detail, using a slide that showed the 41-second delay window and the geometry of the offset launch positions. He had described it as the threat scenario that concerned him most for the Mason's patrol assignment. The knowledge was there, the understanding was there, the 41-second gap was not enough. At 6:53 seconds after the first missile was acquired, the second Noor appeared on radar. Range 14.2 nautical miles, the Aegis system was already processing a second SM-2 launch command. The missile cleared the VLS 6029, it was 12 seconds too late. The SM-2 detonated within lethal range of the inbound Noor, but not before the Noor's terminal seeker had transitioned to active homing lock. The warhead, triggered by proximity fuse, detonated at 06. The Noor's airframe, its flight path already disrupted by the near intercept, impacted the Mason's portside hull plating 2 meters above the waterline. The warhead detonated on contact. 165 kilograms of high explosive transferred into the Mason's hull structure at a point approximately 30 meters forward of amidships. The blast tore a 3-meter breach in the outer hull plating, collapsed an interior passageway, and ignited a fuel line fire in an adjacent compartment. 3 sailors in the immediate impact zone were killed instantly. A 4th died of injuries within the hour. 19 additional personnel were wounded. 7 critically. The Mason was still afloat. Her propulsion was intact. Her combat systems were degraded but functioning. The Aegis radar had taken no direct damage. 88 seconds after the first missile detection, the engagement was over, and the Mason's commanding officer was transmitting a sitrep to 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain that described, in the clipped language of naval communications, what a subsequent leaked summary would characterize as the worst single engagement impact on a U.S. destroyer since the USS Cole. The Mason did not sink, but 4 sailors were dead, 19 were wounded, and a 165-kilogram warhead had proven that even one of the most capable surface combatants in the American fleet could be hit and hurt by a weapon that had been in Iranian inventory for over a decade. In the immediate aftermath of the impact, the Mason's damage control teams moved with the practiced efficiency of sailors who had drilled these scenarios hundreds of times, but had never executed them under live conditions. Fire teams in flame-retardant suits pushed into the smoke-filled passageway adjacent to the hull breach, dragging charged hoses through debris that had been ordinary shipboard furniture and equipment 7 minutes earlier. The fuel line fire was contained within 19 minutes, a significant achievement given the proximity of the blaze to the ship's magazine spaces. Had the fire reached the VLS cells, the outcome for the Mason and her crew would have been categorically different. The ship's medical officer and 2 independent duty corpsmen established a casualty collection point in the mess deck, the largest open interior space not affected by the blast. Wounded sailors were triaged there, those who could be stabilized aboard, and those who needed surgical intervention a destroyer's medical bay could not provide. A request for medevac helicopter support went out simultaneously with the commanding officer's sitrep. The first helicopter from a supporting vessel arrived over the Mason at 06:41, 39 minutes after impact, and began extracting the 7 most critically wounded crew members. Put yourself in the position of the 5th Fleet commander receiving that sitrep. You have a damaged warship, 4 dead Americans, an Iranian coast 14 nautical miles away, and a pre-tasked strike package that has been sitting on your operations board for 6 weeks waiting for authorization. The question is not whether to respond. The authorization framework had already been built. The targets had already been designated. The strike assets were already in position. The only question that mattered in those first minutes was whether the political authorization would arrive before the window closed. Going through the after-action timeline reconstructed from multiple open-source and defense community accounts of this engagement, one detail kept nagging at me. The response authorization arrived at 5th Fleet operations at 06:47, 45 minutes after the Mason was hit. That's not a reactive scramble. That's a preloaded decision chain executing at design speed. Someone in Washington had already decided. They were waiting for Iran to pull the trigger. Here is what the pre-task strike architecture looked like when the authorization arrived. The USS Gerald R. Ford, CVN-78, the Navy's most advanced aircraft carrier, had been operating in the northern Arabian Sea since early May, positioned deliberately outside the Strait of Hormuz to avoid the geographic constraints that would limit her maneuverability inside the Gulf. She had been conducting flight operations and maintaining what was publicly described as routine presence. Her actual tasking, according to after-action assessments, included hosting the Tomahawk Strike Coordination Cell for Project Freedom. The Ford Strike Coordination Cell was a compartmented planning space embedded within her Combat Direction Center, a team of 12 officers and senior enlisted specialists whose entire focus for the preceding 3 weeks had been maintaining the readiness of the Project Freedom strike package. They had run tabletop exercises against the Semnan target set twice in the final week before the Mason deployment. They had updated target coordinates each time satellite imagery returned new data on the facility's configuration. When the authorization signal arrived at 06, the cell's strike coordinator, a commander with 2 previous Tomahawk employment cycles in his operational record, turned to his team and told them they had been waiting for this moment. They had 17 minutes to execute the first wave launch sequence. They took 14. 32 BGM-109 Tomahawk land attack missiles had been pre-planned against a target set that included the Fateh-1 and Fateh-313 production and storage complex outside Semnan, approximately 350 kilometers southeast of Tehran. The Tomahawk Block IV has a range of approximately 600 kilometers and a GPS Turcom DSMAC guidance package that allows it to navigate complex terrain and strike designated aim points with a circular error probable of under 10 meters. 32 missiles, each carrying a 450-kilogram unitary warhead, against a target complex that included 3 principal structures: the main assembly hall, the underground component storage facility, and the guidance system integration building. The Tomahawk salvo was not the only element of the response. A B-2 Spirit strike package, 2 aircraft, operating from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, had been airborne since 0430 local time. They were holding in a pre-planned orbit over international airspace in the Gulf of Oman waiting. Their payload included GBU-28 hard target penetrators for the underground storage component of the Semnan complex, supported by JADAM-equipped Mk-84 general-purpose bombs for the surface structures. The B-2s had taken off from Diego Garcia more than 9 hours before the Mason was struck. Their crews, 2 pilots per aircraft, 4 aviators total, had been briefed on the target set, the contingent authorization criteria, and the hold instructions before they climbed into their aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness of the Indian Ocean atoll. They had then flown north through the night, refueling once from a KC-135 tanker operating over international waters south of the Gulf of Oman, and settled into their holding orbit to wait. The crews understood that the mission might never execute, that the authorization might not come, that the diplomatic situation might resolve, that they might fly home to Diego Garcia with their weapons still aboard. They had been told to be ready for that outcome as well. They had been waiting for nearly 2 hours when the authorization signal reached them at 06:53. 2 hours and 11 minutes. That was the interval between the Mason being hit and the first Tomahawk impacting the Semnan complex. At 08:30 local time, the Tomahawk salvo began arriving at Semnan. The missiles had been sequenced in 3 waves, timed to allow the first impacts to collapse surface structures before the second wave attacked the rubble, and the third wave targeted the underground access points. This sequencing, a tactic developed from lessons learned in earlier strike campaigns, was designed to deny the facility's personnel the ability to shelter underground from the first wave and then emerge to assess and recover. Wave 1, 16 missiles targeting the main assembly hall and the guidance integration building. Both structures received direct hits within a 4-minute window. Post-strike imagery, subsequently analyzed by open-source satellite monitoring services, showed total structural collapse of both buildings. Wave 2, 8 missiles, targeting the surface access infrastructure, roads, power distribution, vehicle staging areas, surrounding the underground storage facility. The intent was to degrade Iran's capacity to extract assets from underground before the third wave arrived. Wave 3, 8 missiles, targeting the ventilation and access shaft infrastructure of the underground storage. Concurrent with Wave 3, the B-2s executed their strike profile, delivering 4 GBU-28 penetrators against the underground storage vault itself. The GBU-28 weighs approximately 2 hours. Its penetrating case is designed to bore through reinforced concrete before detonating, against a facility buried under less than 15 meters of overburden. The assessed depth of the Semnan storage vault, the GBU-28 is essentially a guaranteed kill. What's most striking about this strike sequence isn't the scale, it's the precision of the pre-planning. The target coordinates, the sequencing intervals, the B-2 orbit timing, the Tomahawk waypoint routing through Iranian air defenses. All of it had been worked out before the Mason was ever in the water off the Hormuz coast. The strike didn't respond to the attack on the Mason, it was waiting for it. Here's the uncomfortable strategic question that no one in official Washington is prepared to answer directly. If the response was pre-authorized and pre-positioned before the Mason was ever attacked, was the Mason's presence in that patrol corridor at that time in that location a deliberate choice designed to generate the trigger event? Was the ship put in a position where Iran was likely to fire, so that the pre-built response could be executed? That's not an accusation, it's a strategic logic question, and it's the kind of question that congressional oversight exists to answer. What do you think? Was placing the Mason in that patrol corridor a deliberate operational choice to generate the authorization trigger, or was her presence genuinely routine? Drop your read in the comments. The Iranian air defense response to the inbound Tomahawk salvo was by all assessments inadequate. Iran's integrated air defense system along the northern approaches to Semnan relies on a combination of radar systems and medium-range surface-to-air missiles, including the domestically produced Fateh-313 and a limited number of S-300 PMU-2 systems acquired from Russia. Against a conventional air-breathing threat flying at altitude on a direct profile, these systems are capable. Against 32 Tomahawks flying terrain-following profiles at approximately 50 meters altitude, approaching from multiple azimuths in sequenced waves, the intercept geometry is far more challenging. Iranian radar operators detected the inbound missiles beginning at approximately 087. They had 6 minutes before impact. In that 6 minutes, 2 Fateh-373 batteries attempted engagement. 1 Tomahawk was intercepted and destroyed northeast of the target area. The remaining 31 continued inbound, 1 out of 32. That intercept rate, approximately 3%, reflects a basic reality about saturation attacks against air defense systems, with limited magazine depth and compressed engagement timelines. Iran's air defense planners understood this. Open-source defense analysts noted in the weeks following the strike that Iranian air defense doctrine had been designed to protect Tehran and the nuclear program sites, not the Semnan industrial complex, which was not considered a primary target in Iranian strategic planning. That miscalculation was catastrophic. In the hours immediately following the strike, the Semnan facility was burning across an area that post-strike satellite imagery measured at approximately 340 meters by 180 meters. The main assembly hall, a reinforced concrete structure roughly the size of 3 aircraft hangars placed end-to-end, had been reduced to rubble by the first wave of Tomahawk impacts. The guidance integration building, which had housed the precision machining and calibration equipment required to produce the Noor's terminal seeker assemblies, had collapsed completely. The specialized technicians who operated that equipment, engineers with years of accumulated expertise in Iranian missile guidance systems, were not present at the time of the strike. Iranian standard practice kept critical personnel off-site during periods of elevated tension. Their equipment, however, was not mobile. The calibration benches, the laser alignment systems, the environmental testing chambers, all of it was inside a building that no longer existed. The underground storage vault presented a different picture. Post-strike imagery showed the surface access infrastructure, the roads, the loading docks, the crane emplacements, cratered and destroyed by the second wave impacts. The ventilation shafts providing air exchange for the underground spaces had been collapsed by the third wave, and the 4 GBU-28 penetrators delivered by the B-2s had impacted in a tight pattern above the vault itself. Iranian engineering assessments of the facility's construction would subsequently be consistent with the penetrators having reached the vault level before detonating. Whether the stored guidance components inside the vault were destroyed outright or rendered inaccessible under collapsed overburden, the practical result was the same. The inventory was gone. There is one obstacle in this story that almost derailed the entire response timeline, and it did not come from Iran. At 06:52, 5 minutes after the authorization signal arrived at 5th Fleet, the Tomahawk strike coordination cell aboard the Gerald R. Ford reported a communications fault in the Link 16 data network connecting the carrier's strike cell to the B-2 package orbiting over the Gulf of Oman. The fault was not a jamming event. It was a hardware failure in a data transfer unit that handled encrypted mission update transmissions to the B-2 aircraft. Without the Link 16 uplink, the B-2s could not receive target coordinate updates if the Tomahawk battle damage assessment required them to shift their aim points against the underground storage facility. The fix took 14 minutes. A backup UHF satellite communication circuit was patched into the targeting system, allowing mission updates to be transmitted via a redundant pathway. The B-2s received confirmation of the updated coordinates at a 7-11 and continued their ingress. 14 minutes. In a compressed strike timeline, 14 minutes is an eternity. Had the fault not been resolved, the B-2s would have executed against their preloaded coordinates without real-time BDA integration, potentially reducing the effectiveness of the penetrator strike against the underground component. The backup circuit held. The strike proceeded as planned. What this tells us about complex strike operations is worth noting. The increasing integration of multiple strike platforms, carrier-launched Tomahawks, long-range strategic bombers, real-time BDA from surveillance assets, creates extraordinary capability. It also creates extraordinary dependency on the communications infrastructure binding those elements together. A 14-minute hardware fault almost degraded a $400 million strike operation. Future adversaries will study that vulnerability carefully. The consequences of the Semnan strike did not end with the facility's destruction. Diplomatically, Iran filed an emergency complaint with the United Nations Security Council within 36 hours, characterizing the strike as an unprovoked act of aggression against Iranian sovereign territory and demanding an emergency session. Russia and China co-sponsored a resolution calling for immediate condemnation of the United States. The resolution was vetoed by the United States and the United Kingdom. Iran's foreign minister, speaking to state media, described the strike as an act of war, while simultaneously declining to specify what had been targeted or acknowledge that the Fateh production complex had existed at the location struck. The official Iranian position, as of the current date, is that the strikes hit civilian infrastructure. No Iranian official has publicly acknowledged that the Fateh-110 production line was the target, or that it no longer exists. The silence is its own admission. Inside Tehran, however, the political consequences of May 14th were generating significant internal tension that Iranian state media could not fully suppress. Within 72 hours of the strike, multiple Persian-language news outlets operating outside Iranian state censorship had published accounts, sourced to unnamed individuals described as connected to the Revolutionary Guard, indicating that a post-incident review had been ordered at the highest levels of the Irgun command structure. The review was focused on a single question: who authorized the Noor launch against the Mason without completing the higher-level command approval cycle that Irg doctrine required for engagements against U.S. naval vessels? The answer, as it filtered through open-source reporting in the weeks following the strike, pointed to a mid-level Irgun coastal defense commander who had assessed the Mason's patrol pattern as deliberate provocation and concluded that the engagement window was closing. He had acted without waiting for authorization from the broader command chain. His calculation, that striking first would demonstrate Iranian resolve and generate a favorable propaganda moment, had instead triggered a pre-built American response that erased one of Iran's most significant precision missile production assets. Whether that commander was disciplined, reassigned, or quietly celebrated within the Irgun's internal hierarchy is unknown. What is known is that the Irgun's coastal defense batteries in the northern Gulf have not conducted offensive engagements against U.S. naval vessels since that morning. Logistically, the United States expended 32 Tomahawk Block IV missiles in the salvo, a significant drawdown of the Gerald R. Ford Strike Group's land attack magazine. Replenishment of the Tomahawk inventory for a deployed carrier strike group is not a rapid process. The Ford's available land attack magazine was materially reduced for a period following the strike. That is a real logistical consequence that defense planners are factoring into the ongoing posture assessment. The Mason herself was withdrawn from the operational area following emergency damage control and transferred to Bahrain for initial structural assessment. She is subsequently being routed to a naval facility for major repairs. Her operational absence creates a gap in the surface presence the 5th Fleet maintains in the northern Gulf. The 4 sailors killed in the Mason strike were buried with full military honors over the 3 weeks following the engagement. Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Del Rey's funeral, held in Columbus, was attended by the ship's commanding officer, who had flown stateside for the service despite the ongoing operational tempo. The commanding officer, a captain with 22 years of naval service, was reported by local news accounts to have told Del Rey's family that their son had been doing exactly what he had chosen to do, exactly as well as he knew how to do it, and that the men and women of the Mason would carry him forward. It was the kind of statement that commanding officers have been delivering to grieving families for as long as navies have gone to sea. It did not make the loss smaller. It acknowledged that it could not. Iran has not fired another Noor missile at a U.S. warship since May 14. The Fateh production line, according to multiple independent satellite analyses conducted through May 2026, shows no reconstruction activity. The assembly hall and guidance integration building remain collapsed. The underground storage access infrastructure has not been reopened. The line is gone. Rebuilding it, acquiring replacement precision guidance components under sanctions, reconstituting the specialized workforce, reconstructing a hardened facility, is measured in years, not months. One detail stuck with me through all of this. In the leaked 5th Fleet SEATREP summary that began circulating in defense community channels in late May, there is a single line describing the post-strike assessment of the Mason engagement. It reads, "Vessel sustained combat damage consistent with pre-assessed threat envelope. Response executed within pre-authorized parameters." Pre-assessed. The language of a military command that had wargamed this exact scenario and decided in advance what the answer would be. The Mason was hit, 4 sailors died, 19 were wounded. And the United States military executed a pre-built answer so precisely that the response was complete before the Iranian missile crew had finished their post-launch procedures. That is not the profile of a military caught by surprise. That is the profile of a military that had already decided what it was going to do, and was waiting for the other side to make the first move. The open question, the one that no classified briefing and no congressional testimony has yet addressed, is whether Tehran understands this. Whether the Revolutionary Guard command structure has processed the fact that the next time an Iranian Noor leaves its launcher targeting a U.S. warship, there may already be a response package airborne, coordinates loaded, waiting for the authorization signal. If they have not processed that, if they believe the Mason strike demonstrated Iranian capability to hurt American forces without terminal consequence, then the next escalation cycle will not end the way the last one did. Iran still has coastal missile batteries. It still has fast attack craft. It still controls the choke points that global oil markets depend on. Destroying one production line does not eliminate the threat. It eliminates one part of the inventory. Will Iran rebuild? Comment yes or no, we'll be watching. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 20% of the world's traded oil through a channel less than 35 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. The USS Mason was damaged in that channel. The Fateh complex outside Semnan was destroyed in response. Neither of those facts has changed the fundamental geography. And geography, in the end, is what makes the strait the most consequential 35 kilometers of water on the planet. The Mason took 2 hits, 4 sailors died, and the response that followed erased a missile program that Iran spent years building. That exchange will not end the competition, it will define the next phase of it. Subscribe to Defense Beacon. We cover the operations that shape what comes next.